When White mentioned, and I want you to hear this carefully because the wording matters, she mentioned almost in passing that the elbow had actually been sore for a while. She said the training staff had been doing treatment on it. She said they'd been trying to get Cunningham ready to play. Stop right there. The elbow had been sore for a while. Treatment had already been underway. This was not a new acute injury that happened in practice Tuesday morning. This was an ongoing issue that the organization had been managing internally for some period of time without telling anyone. Nobody knew. Nobody outside that building had any idea that one of their most important players had been dealing with a lingering issue. And the first the public hears about any of it is when Sophie shows up on the injury report less than 24 hours before a nationally relevant game. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm going to say something that I need you to actually hear. I am not accusing the Indiana Fever of manufacturing a fake injury. I am not saying Sophie Cunningham is perfectly healthy and sitting out for reasons that have nothing to do with her elbow. What I am saying, and what I think any honest observer of this franchise, Sophie Cunningham is not just a rotation player. She's not a bench piece that you can plug in and pull out depending on matchups. She is the identity of this team in ways that the stat sheet barely captures. She is the enforcer. She is the player who sets the physical and emotional tone for everything that happens on that floor. She is the woman who, when things get rough and ugly and physical, when the intensity hits a level that tests people's commitment, steps into that space without hesitation and makes it known that the Indiana Fever is not going to be bullied by anybody. The fanbase, particularly the passionate, vocal, deeply invested core of Caitlin Clark's supporters, absolutely adores her for it. The chants of "Free Sophie" after any flagrant foul call against her are not ironic. That's not fans being sarcastic or making a joke. That is genuine love. That is a player who has earned her place in the hearts of this fanbase by showing up and competing with everything she has every single night. She brings something that you cannot measure in points per game or defensive rating. She brings credibility. She brings toughness. She brings a statement that this team is willing to go to battle. And here's the other thing about Sophie Cunningham that makes this situation even more layered and complicated than it appears on the surface. She was the player who delivered the inbound pass that led to the most iconic moment of the 2026 WNBA season so far. Picture this moment. The Indiana Fever are trailing the Washington Mystics by 1 point. There are just over 4 seconds left on the clock. The entire arena is holding its breath. Sophie Cunningham takes the ball out of bounds, surveys the entire floor, and launches a perfect cross-court pass to Caitlin Clark. Clark catches it in rhythm, steps back, and buries a deep three-pointer with 1.2 seconds remaining to win the game. The arena went absolutely insane. The internet followed right behind it. For about 12 hours, everything was perfect in Fever Nation. Sophie Cunningham was a hero. Caitlin Clark was Caitlin Clark. The world made sense. And then the day after the game, the whole thing turned into a controversy. Because Sophie Cunningham went on social media and posted a graphic that many fans interpreted as suggesting the final play had not actually gone according to the coaching staff's plan. The interpretation was that she had gone rogue on the inbound, that she had improvised the pass to Clark rather than executing the play that Stephanie White had drawn up on the sideline. The internet exploded. People started digging into the footage. People started questioning the coaching. People started wondering if this was a sign of deeper issues between the coach and her players. Then Cunningham came back and commented on the post, writing in plain text that people were reading way too much into it, and that the play was in fact exactly what the coach drew up and they executed it perfectly. So she walked it back. They wanted the 2.5 million viewers and the sold-out arenas and the merchandise sales without understanding that all of that comes with a responsibility to communicate clearly and honestly with the people who are sustaining those numbers. Here's what makes this situation so aggravating for anyone paying attention. The Fever didn't have to choose this path. Stephanie White didn't have to come into Indianapolis with a defensive posture about media and fan criticism. She could have said, "I'm here to coach basketball and communicate as clearly as possible about team decisions. The fans brought this team into the mainstream. They deserve respect and transparency." She could have built a culture where difficult questions are answered directly rather than dismissed as trolling. She could have created an environment where the team's medical staff communicates injury information early rather than at the last possible minute. She could have trained her players to tell consistent stories about what happens on the court. She did not do any of those things. Instead, she brought the exact defensive posture that created the problem in Connecticut directly into Indianapolis. And now every single organizational decision, every injury, every communication gap, every contradictory statement is filtered through the lens of that initial framing. Is this a trust issue? Is this spin? Is this an honest mistake, or is this narrative management's basketball team into a cultural phenomenon? And when that audience asks questions that make the organization uncomfortable, the answer cannot be to dismiss them as a fringe problem that the media should stop amplifying. You wanted the new deal. You wanted the new money. You wanted the 2.5 million viewers and the sold-out arenas and the cultural moment that comes with Caitlin Clark playing professional basketball. Congratulations, you got all of it. And what comes with all of that is exactly what comes with it in the NFL, in the NBA, the kind where people notice when the communication does not add up. The kind where an unexplained injury at an inconvenient time generates more questions than a clear, transparent, early announcement would have. The kind where contradictory player statements about a crucial play get picked apart by thousands of people across dozens of platforms. The kind where every decision made by a coaching staff gets analyzed and questioned and debated because the entire basketball community is watching. The Fever and their coaching staff did not sign up for a protected garden where they could make decisions in private and announce them whenever they felt like it. They signed up for the big stage. They signed up for the moment they took the job in the most watched market in women's basketball. And the big stage has rules. Those rules are not written down by the league. They're not formalized in some official document, but they're real. They exist in the reality of what happens when you operate at the highest levels of professional sports. Rule number 1, communication is a leadership responsibility, not something you outsource to a training staff and hope nobody notices. Rule number 2, transparency builds trust faster than anything else, and the absence of transparency destroys it faster than mistakes ever could. Rule number 3, when you have a dedicated, invested fanbase, you have to treat that fanbase like partners in the story, not children who need to be. Your job is to be so consistent and clear and honest that the narrative controls itself. The Indiana Fever organization has violated every single one of those rules multiple times in the past 18 months. And now, they're surprised that the trust is gone. They're shocked that fans are skeptical. They're confused about why a sore elbow generates conspiracy theories instead of a shrug and a get well soon. They're baffled by the fact that a fanbase that was thrilled to have them in the mainstream is now questioning every organizational decision. But here's the reality that they need to understand. You don't get to choose the rules. You don't get to decide that you want the massive new audience, but you don't want to treat them with respect. You don't get to take the money from the new media deal and then operate like you're a small market team that can keep everything internal. You don't get to live in the new basketball world with the cultural relevance and the global attention and then pretend the old rules about privacy and limited communication still apply. They don't. They never did. And the sooner the Fever organization understands that, the sooner they can actually start fixing the problems that are sitting at the foundation of everything that's going wrong. The scrutiny is not going away. The new audience is not going away. The demanding fans with the YouTube channels and the detailed analysis and the critical eye, they're not going anywhere. They're the mainstream now. They're the future of women's basketball. And the organizations that figure out how to communicate with them clearly and honestly and directly, those are the organizations that are going to thrive. The organizations that treat them like trolls and noise and a problem to be managed, those organizations are going to spend the next 5 years wondering why their fan base is frustrated. And now here's the thing that ties the entire day together in a way that almost feels poetic if it were not so aggravating. The game happened. Sophie Cunningham sat in street clothes at Gainbridge Fieldhouse with a sore right elbow. She was healthy enough to be at the arena, obviously. She was managing the injury. And Caitlin Clark went out on that floor and put up 32 points and 10 assists. Not 28 and 8, not 30 and 6. 32 and 10. Historic. Dominant. The kind of performance that should have been the entire story of the night. Aaliyah Boston was absolutely historic herself, dropping 34 points and 12 rebounds, attacking the paint, defending everything, doing exactly what a franchise cornerstone is supposed to do. And together, they made WNBA history. Clark and Boston became the first pair of teammates in WNBA history to both post 30-point double-doubles in the same game. Think about that for a moment. In the history of the WNBA, with all of the elite talent that has played in this league, no two teammates had ever done that simultaneously until Thursday night in Indianapolis. Indiana beat Chicago 114-106 in overtime after nearly giving the entire game away in the final seconds of regulation. There was a turnover. It's the easiest argument to make when you have Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston on your roster. Just win the game. Everything else becomes secondary. Everything else becomes noise. But here's the thing that the Fever organization does not seem to understand, and this is the critical piece that connects all of this together. The scoreboard is not the only thing being measured here. Yes, the game was won. Yes, the Stars performed. Yes, the team moved to 7-5 and stayed competitive in their conference. All of that is true and all of it matters. But simultaneously, other things are also being measured. The trust is being measured. The credibility is being measured. When you hide an injury until the last possible moment and then act surprised that people ask questions, you're measuring trust. When you have your players give contradictory accounts of a crucial play and then don't address it directly, all three of those measurements are in the red. A win feels good. A win on the scoreboard gives you momentum. A win makes the players happy and the fans happy and creates positive energy. That's all real. That's all valuable. But it does not repair the underlying issues that are sitting at the foundation of this franchise's relationship with its audience. One good performance does not fix a pattern of poor communication. One victory does not rebuild trust that's been eroded by repeated credibility failures. One game where the Stars deliver does not resolve the fundamental dysfunction in how this organization interfaces with the outside world. And this is where the Fever are making their biggest mistake. They're treating each game as an isolated incident. They're treating each injury, each communication failure, each contradiction as something that gets erased as soon as the team wins the next game. They're operating as though trust is something that automatically resets when the scoreboard shows a victory. It's not. It doesn't. And the more they operate under that assumption, the more they're going to find themselves in exactly this situation over and over again, because the fan base is not going to forget. The critical media is not going to move on. The question about that from the beginning, because this is going to get critical, and I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that I'm suggesting she doesn't know how to run a basketball team. She won a WNBA Coach of the Year award with the Connecticut Sun in 2023. She took that team to the playoffs for 3 straight years. She has been in this league as a player, as an assistant coach, and as a head coach for decades. She knows the game. She understands basketball at the highest levels. Her X's and O's are sound. Her not the same as coaching any prior roster she has managed. That's not a statement about White's abilities. That's a statement about the unique nature of the situation. Clark is not just a player. She is a phenomenon. She is the reason that hundreds of new media outlets, millions, leave. She changed the sport. And the pressure that comes with coaching that phenomenon requires a level of institutional transparency and media relations sophistication that goes beyond even the highest level of traditional basketball coaching competence. This is what nobody seems to want to say out loud. You can be an excellent basketball coach and still be inadequate for this particular job, because this particular job requires more than basketball coaching. It requires institutional leadership. It requires understanding how to communicate with a global, diverse, invested fan base. It requires the wisdom to know when to speak publicly and when to stay quiet. It requires the maturity to accept criticism without framing all criticism as a personal attack. It requires the sophistication to separate legitimate questions from bad faith attacks instead of lumping them all together. Right now, Stephanie White does not possess that level of sophistication. She's operating as though she can coach basketball and delegate everything else, and everything else is burning down around her. The injury communication is poor. The player management is creating questions. The media relations are defensive. The framing of criticism as trolling is creating more criticism. Every single organizational decision is being filtered through a lens of skepticism because she has earned that skepticism through her own actions and choices. And here's where it gets really aggravating. None of this had to happen. White could have walked into Indianapolis and said, I'm here to win basketball games and to communicate as clearly as possible about how we're doing it. The fans brought this team into the mainstream. They deserve respect. They deserve transparency. I'm going to give them both. She could have set a tone. She could have established a culture. She could have changed the entire dynamic of how this organization interfaces with the outside world. Instead, she brought the defensive posture she developed in Connecticut directly into Indianapolis, and she's applied it to a situation that happened was the creation of a rhetorical framework that could be used to dismiss any criticism as part of the problem. And now, when fans ask legitimate questions about injury communication or contradictory player statements or coaching decisions, they get categorized as trolls. They get told that they're part of the toxicity problem. They get made to feel like they're the issue instead of the organization's communication being the issue. The Fever are too talented to stay stuck in this cycle forever. That much is clear. They have Caitlin Clark in her prime. They have Aaliyah Boston, who is playing some of the best basketball of her career. They have Kelsey Mitchell, a proven scorer and defender. They have a roster that on paper should be competing for a title. And they're sitting at 7-5 after 12 games with a coaching narrative who publicly told the world she was going to clean up the toxicity around this franchise, and then proceeded to become one of the primary sources of the drama she said she wanted to eliminate. That's not a basketball problem. That's a leadership problem. And until Stephanie White understands that distinction, until she accepts that coaching Caitlin Clark requires more than basketball expertise, until she's willing to fundamentally change how this organization communicates with the outside world, this exact cycle is going to keep repeating. Injury confusion, communication gap, fan reaction, organizational frustration, media criticism, accusations of toxicity. Rinse, repeat. The roster is too good for this to go on forever, but fine. Let me fan base like partners in the story. And until that changes, until someone in that building decides that transparency and honesty or a decision is made, the organization keeps it internal for as long as possible. Information slowly leaks out or gets announced at the last possible moment with minimal context. Fans and media ask questions because the communication was unclear or late. The organization frames those questions as trolling or negativity instead of addressing the legitimate concern. The story becomes bigger than it needed to be because poor communication created a vacuum that speculation filled. The team wins the game anyway because they have good players. The organization says, "See, we were right to manage it that way," without understanding that the lack of communication is what created the entire problem. Then it happens again. Different player, different situation, same pattern, same communication failure, same lack of transparency, same framing of questions as trolling, same eventual victory that makes the organization think they handled it perfectly. And the trust keeps eroding, game by game, decision by decision. Communication failure by communication is being honest with them because the pattern has been so consistent. This is what Stephanie White walked into when she took this job. This is the weight she carries because of her own framing in Connecticut and because of her own choices in Indianapolis. This is what happens when a leadership group decides that it's more important to control information than to share it. This is what happens when you treat your fanbase like a problem instead of like partners. This is what happens when you refuse to accept that the biggest step the WNBA ever took, bringing Caitlin Clark into the league, came with responsibilities that extend far beyond basketball. The Fever had the chance to be different. They had the chance to be the organization that figured out how to communicate with the new mainstream audience. They had the chance to be the franchise that understood that transparency builds loyalty faster than anything else. They had the chance to lead by example and show other organizations how to handle the pressure and the scrutiny that comes with being in the cultural moment. Instead, they chose the path of control. They chose the path of narrative management to spend the rest of this season and potentially the rest of their tenure as leaders of this organization, dealing with the consequences of those choices. What would it take to fix this? It would take Stephanie White going to a press conference and saying something like, "We've done a poor job of communicating with our fan base, and we're going to do better." It would take the organization committing to early, transparent communication about injuries and decisions. It would take the coaching staff training the players to tell consistent stories about what happens on the court. It would take a fundamental shift in how the organization thinks about its a willingness to admit that poor communication has been a problem. I don't think that's going to happen. Based on everything we've seen, I don't think the Fever organization has the self-awareness to make that admission. I think they're going to keep operating the same way. I think the next injury is going to be communicated poorly. I think fans are going to ask questions. I think the organization is going to dismiss those questions as trolling. And I think we're going to have this exact same conversation 6 weeks from now with a different player and a different injury. The Fever are too talented to miss the playoffs. The Fever might actually make a run at a championship, but they're going to do it while simultaneously managing a fan base that doesn't trust them and a media ecosystem that's increasingly skeptical of their decisions. And that's entirely on them. That's the consequence of their choices. Here's what we're working with right now out of Indianapolis. Keeps coming back to haunt her every single decision. Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston writing WNBA history on a night when the narrative should have been simple and clean. Instead, we got drama, contradiction, suspicion, and a 3-game story that somehow is still not fully resolved. The Fever have everything they need to win a championship. They have the talent. They have the resources. They have the cultural everything. They're actively choosing to manage narratives when transparency would be faster and easier and would actually rebuild the trust that they keep destroying. Sophie Cunningham will be fine. Her elbow will heal. She'll come back and the fan base will. The organization will still be operating the same way. The communication will still be unclear. The next injury will be handled the same way. And the cycle will continue until someone in that building finally understands that the fanbase brought them to this moment, and the fanbase deserves better than this.